Topic of the lecture: physiological and pathological types of occlusion. First of all, I would like
The
to
facial features
remind
of the
you
human embryo develop rapidly very early on in
about
pregnancy, beginning around the
how
fourth week after
develop
conception. Many of the structures of
human's
the face
body in
originate from a group
utero.
of cells called cranial neural crest
The
cells.
facial features of the human
These cells
embryo
move in a
develop
distinct
rapidly
pattern
very
from the
early
neural
on in
tube
pregnancy,
located in the back of
beginning
the
around the
embryo
fourth
to
week
create
after
the various
conception.
structures of the face.
Many of the structures of the face
Aberrations in the
originate from a group of
formation
cells
or
called
behavior
cranial
of these
neural crest
cells are the
cells.
main causes of
These cells
abnormalities
move
in the
a
head and
distinct
face.
pattern from the neural tube
During the
located in
first
back
3
of the
days of
embryo
development,
to create
the
various
fertilized
structures
ovum,
of the
or
face.
egg, is located in the fallopian tube.
Aberrations in the formation or
As it
behavior
travels
of these
down the
cells
tube,
are
it
the main
undergoes
causes of
rapid divisions
abnormalities
to
in
form
the
a
head and
cluster of
face.
cells called the morula.
During the first 3
These
days
cells
of
then
development,
organize
the
themselves
fertilized
to form the
ovum, or egg,
blastocyst,
is
and by the
located
end
in
of
the
week
fallopian
5, the
tube.
fully formed
As it
blastocyst comes
travels
into
down the
contact
tube,
with the
it
uterine
undergoes
wall for
rapid divisions
implantation.
to form a cluster of cells
During the
called
second week of
morula.
development, the inside of the
These cells then
blastocyst,
organize
known as the
themselves to form the
embryoblast, becomes
blastocyst,
two
and by
layers,
the end of week
the
5, the
hypoblast
fully
and the
formed
epiblast
blastocyst
layers.
comes into contact
Together,
with the
these
uterine
layers
wall
form
for
an oval-shaped
implantation.
disc-like structure.
During the second week of
In the
development,
third week
the
of
inside
development,
of the
a streak is
blastocyst,
created on
known
the
as the
surface of the
embryoblast,
epiblast,
becomes two
during which
layers,
time the cells of the
hypoblast and
epiblast detach and
layers.
migrate.
Together,
These
layers
migrating
form an
cells create
oval-shaped
3
disc-like
layers,
structure.
the ectoderm, mesoderm,
In
and
the third week
endoderm
of
layers,
development, a
which
streak
go
is
on to
created on the
contribute
surface
cells
of the
to form all the
epiblast,
tissues
during
and
which
organs in the
time the
human
cells
body.
of the epiblast detach and
In the
migrate.
3rd to 4th weeks of
These
development, a
migrating
cord
cells
called the
create 3
notochord
layers,
is
the
formed.
ectoderm,
This
mesoderm, and
induces the
endoderm
cells
layers,
in the
which
overlying
go on to
ectoderm to
contribute
thicken,
cells to
forming
form
a
all the
region called
tissues
the
and
neural
organs in
plate
the
along
human
the
body.
back of the embryo. The
In the
edges of the
3rd to
neural
4th
plate
weeks of
elevate to
development,
form
a
the neural
cord called
folds
the
that
notochord
eventually
is
fuse to
formed.
form the neural tube.
This induces the cells
During
in
this
the overlying
process, neural
ectoderm
crest
to
cells are
thicken,
formed
forming a
along the
region
entire
called the
length
neural
of the
plate
tube at the
along the
tip
back
of
of
the
the
folding
embryo.
neural folds.
The edges of the neural plate
Neural crest
elevate to
cells
form
formed
the
from the
neural
head or
folds that
cranial
eventually
region
fuse
are
to
called
form the
cranial
neural
neural
tube.
crest cells, or
During this
CNCCs.
process, neural crest cells are formed
These
along
cells
the entire
multiply
length of
and
the
soon
tube
start
at the tip
migrating
of the
over long
folding neural
distances
folds.
in distinct paths
Neural
from the
crest
back of
cells
the
formed
embryo
from the
towards the
head or
front of the
cranial
embryo.
region are called cranial neural
Once they
crest
arrive at
cells,
their
or
target
CNCCs.
destinations in the facial regions,
These cells
CNCCs
multiply
further
and soon
develop and
start
mature
migrating over
and
long
ultimately
distances
contribute
in
to a
distinct
substantial
paths
amount
from
of
the
the
back of the
structures in the
embryo
head and neck
towards the
region,
front of the
such as
embryo.
bones, cartilage, and
Once they
nerves.
arrive at their target
Growth,
destinations in the facial
migration, and
regions,
subsequent
CNCCs
differentiation
further
of
develop and
CNCCs
mature
are
and
critically
ultimately
important for
contribute to
proper
a
development
substantial
of the
amount of the
normal
structures
structures
in the
of the
head and
facial
neck
region.
region, such as bones,
Soon after the
cartilage, and
CNCCs
nerves.
reach their final
Growth,
destination, the
migration,
facial
and
structures begin
subsequent
to take shape
differentiation of
externally.
CNCCs
By
are
the
critically
4th week of
important for proper
development,
development
the
of the
embryo is
normal structures
characterized
of
by
the
5
facial
facial
region.
swellings: the
Soon after the
frontonasal
CNCCs
prominence
reach their
and the
final
paired maxillary
destination,
and
the
mandibular
facial structures
prominences.
begin to take shape
These structures
externally.
are formed in part from the
By the 4th
migration
week of
and
development,
proliferation of the
the embryo is
CNCCs
characterized
from
by
different
5
regions
facial
of the neural
swellings:
tube.
the frontonasal
In a
prominence
5-week-old
and
embryo,
paired
the nasal
maxillary and
placodes, which
mandibular
will go on to
prominences.
become the olfactory
These structures
system,
are formed
and
in
the
part
optic
from the
placodes,
migration and
which will become the lenses
proliferation
of the eyes, will
CNCCs
form.
from different regions
In
of the
addition,
neural
the
tube.
maxillary and
In
mandibular
a
prominences
5-week-old
enlarge
embryo, the
and grow
nasal
forward and
placodes,
towards
which
the
will go
middle,
on to become
eventually
the
giving
olfactory
rise to
system,
the upper and
and
lower
the optic
jaws,
placodes,
respectively.
which will become the lenses
In a
of the eyes,
6-week-old
will
embryo,
form.
the 2
In
mandibular
addition,
prominences
the
fuse to
maxillary
form
and
the lower
mandibular
jaw.
prominences
At this
enlarge
point, the
and grow
outline of the
forward
mouth
and
is
towards the
visible.
middle, eventually
In the
giving rise
7-week-old
to the upper and
embryo,
lower
the
jaws,
maxillary
respectively.
prominences grow and
In
fuse
the
to form the
6-week-old
border of the
embryo,
nostril
the
and
two
the upper
mandibular
lip.
prominences fuse to
Merging
form
of the
the lower
maxillary
jaw.
and mandibular
At this point,
prominences
the outline
forms
of
the
the mouth
cheeks
is visible.
and the corners of the mouth.
In the 7-week-old embryo,
The philtrum of the
maxillary
upper lip and
prominences
palate
grow
are
and
also
fuse to
created
form
at
the
this
border
time.
of the nostril and the upper lip.
In this flurry of activity
Merging
in the
of the
first 7
maxillary
weeks
and
after
mandibular
fertilization,
prominences
the
forms
5
the
facial
cheeks and the
prominences
corners
give
of the
rise
mouth.
to the formation of the forehead and
The
sides of
philtrum
the
of the
face,
upper lip and
middle and
palate are
sides of the
also
nose,
created at
the
this time.
philtrum, the upper lip, the
In this flurry
palate,
of
and the
activity
lower
in the
jaw.
first 7 weeks after
By the 7th week
fertilization,
of human
the 5
embryonic
facial
development,
prominences give
most of the
rise to the
facial
formation
structures
of the
can be
forehead and
observed.
sides of the face,
In the
middle
next
and
few
sides
months of
of the nose,
development, the
the
initial
philtrum, the
cartilaginous
upper lip,
skeleton of the
the
face
palate,
is
and
replaced
the
by
lower
bone,
jaw.
and there is an
By
overall
the 7th
increase
week
in
of
shape and
human
size of the
embryonic
different
development,
structures of the
most of the
face.
facial structures can
From
be
childhood
observed.
to adulthood, the face
In the
continues
next
to
few
develop
months of
through further
development,
growth
the
and
initial
remodeling.
cartilaginous skeleton of the face is replaced by bone, and there is an overall increase in shape and size of the different structures of the face. From childhood to adulthood, the face continues to develop through further growth and remodeling.
Please notice that palate initially development in a vertical direction. And only then we'll get horizontal position. So, and now let's talk about physiological types of occlusion. First of all, we need to know that there are different signs of physiological and pathological occlusion. And they are divided into extraoral signs, like facial signs, symmetrical and proportionality, and jaw signs, correct harmonious, and intraoral signs, occlusion. So extraoral and intraoral. I like this occlusion. What does it mean, symmetry? Symmetry is a situation when one half of one thing is the same like opposite half. It means that right side of face is the same as left side of face. But we need to know about opposite situation to symmetry, asymmetry. What does it mean, asymmetry? Asymmetry, it is a reduction of proportion between the left and right sides of the face. And this pathology often associated with syndromes which can complicate treatment. Next facial sign, proportionality. Proportionality, it is sign when the upper and lower anterior face heights should be approximately equal. We know, I would like to mention you that we know 4 types of physiological occlusion: orthognathic bite, straight bite, physiological biprognatism, and opistognatic bite. Once again, orthognathic bite, straight bite, physiological biprognatism, and opistognatic bite. And we know 10 characteristics of the orthognatic bite. First characteristic, the upper frontal teeth cover the lower ones by 1/3 length of the lower teeth crowns. The upper frontal teeth cover the lower ones by 1/3 length of the lower teeth crowns. Second characteristic, the tubercle of the upper canine tooth crown is located between the lower canine tooth and the first premolar. The tubercle of the upper canine tooth crown is located between the lower canine and the first premolar. Third characteristic, the central line between the central incisors of the upper and lower jaws is coincides. The central line between the central incisors of the upper and lower jaws is coincides. Fourth one, the mesial buccal tubercle of the upper first molar is located in the transverse sulcus of the similar lower tooth. The mesial buccal cusp of the upper first molar is located in the transverse sulcus of the similar lower tooth. Fifth one, every tooth of the upper jaw has two antagonists, similar and standing behind, except for the lower central incisors and upper wisdom teeth. So every tooth of the upper jaw has two antagonists, similar and standing behind, except for the lower central incisors and upper wisdom teeth. Sixth characteristic, the buccal tubercles of the upper lateral teeth cover the buccal tubercles of the lower ones, and the palatine tubercles of the upper teeth are located between the buccal and lingual tubercles of the lower teeth. Once again, the buccal tubercles of the upper lateral teeth cover the buccal tubercles of the lower ones, and the palatine tubercles of the upper teeth are located between the buccal and lingual tubercles of the lower teeth. Seventh characteristic, the upper dental arc is semi-elliptical. The lower one is parabolic. In temporary occlusion, there is semicircle on both jaws. The upper dental arc is semi-elliptical, the lower parabolic. In temporal occlusion, semicircle. Eighth characteristic, the dental arches of the upper and lower jaws are symmetrical. It means that right and left halves are similar. Upper jaw and lower jaw. The dental arches of the upper and lower jaws are symmetrical. Ninth characteristic of the orthognatic bite. In the state of central occlusion, there is a full occlusive contact between all teeth. except for unerupted ones. And last characteristic of the orthognathic bite: in the state of physiological rest, an interocclusive space varying within 2 mm arises between dental arches. But notice that key word in this definition is physiological. Rest must be physiological, because in case of non-physiological rest, this space can be more than 2 mm. And let's talk about next types of physiological occlusion. Straight bite. What differences between orthognathic bite and straight bite? Please notice, doctors, that a correlation between buccal teeth, premolars and molars, in all types of physiological occlusion is the same, and differences are observed only in frontal area. So, persons with straight bite have straight contacts between upper and lower incisors. Contacts like H to H. And angle between longitudinal axis of upper and lower incisors is more than 140 degrees. Opposite situation, physiological biprognatism. Similar situation. Correlation between upper and lower buccal teeth is the same, but frontal teeth are proclined, tilted forward. But please notice, without spaces, without tremors and diastemas. And interincisor angle is less than 120 degrees. Normal value of this angle is 130 degrees, plus minus 10 degrees. It means that this angle from 120 to 140 is normal. Opistognatic bite. What does it mean? It means that molars and premolars have correct the same position, but frontal teeth are tilted backward. But please notice, without crowding and without any pathology. And of course, in that case, interincisor angle will be more than 180 degrees. Or let's mention geometry, more than open angle. And Let's mention about Andrew's 6 keys of occlusion. You know that first K of occlusion is called correct inclination of a long axis buccal teeth, and this angle will be more than 90 degrees. Second K, angulation. Angulation, it is angle between perpendicular line to occlusal plane and a long axis of tooth. They are shown positive angulation. Third K, called torque. It is angle between perpendicular line to occlusal horizontal plane and line passes through the most forward point of crown part. And we know that torque can be positive and negative. And you need to remember that torque of buccal teeth is negative. Fourth K, called rotation. Why this K is very important? Because rotated tooth will take more space in the dental root. If tooth will be rotated, it will take more space in dental root. Fifth key of occlusion by Andrews. Tight approximal contacts between teeth in dental root without spaces, without tremors and diastemas. And 6K of occlusion by Andrews, Spee curve. You know that normal deepness of this curve is not more than 2 millimeters. And now, let's talk about classification of malocclusion. But firstly, we need to know where do we begin? Why do we need to classify malocclusion? Classification is the morphological description of the dental, skeletal and soft tissue deviations from the norm. And all morphological deviations from the norm can be compiled into a problem list, which is essential for treatment planning. And now let's mention about orientation planes. First, we need to establish planes of reference in order to communicate which dimension our problem lies. You know that in medicine there are three mutually perpendicular planes: sagittal plane, coronal plane, and transversal plane. In medicine in total and in dentistry partially, sagittal plane. It is an imaginary plane that passes longitudinally through the middle of the head and divides it into right and left halves. And this plane used to describe anterior-posterior relationships. Sagittal plane has synonym median plane. Next plane, coronal or tube, longitudinally through the head, perpendicular to the sagittal plane, dividing the head into front and back, used to describe superior-inferior relationships. And next plane, transversal or horizontal plane. Transverse plane, aka horizontal plane, it is an imaginary plane that passes through the head at right angles to the sagittal and frontal planes, dividing the head into upper and lower halves, used to describe right to left relationships. And now let's talk about angle classification. In 1890, Edward Angle published the first classification of malocclusion. The classification are based on the relationship of the mesiobuccal cusp of the maxillary first molar and the buccal groove of the mandibular first molar. If this molar relationship exists, then the teeth can align into normal occlusion. But, like type of pathological occlusion, Angle proposed described distal occlusion. It is situation when mesial buccal cusp of the upper first molar is located to front from median groove of lower, transverse groove of lower first molar. And Angle divided distal occlusion or second class of pathology into two subdivisions. Into two divisions. Division 1 and Division 2. You will meet in literature diagnoses like Class 2 Division 1 or Class 2 Division 2. What does it mean? It means that Class 2 Division 1 has distal correlation between upper and lower first molars, but has sagittal gap between frontal teeth. Instead of class 2 division 2, it is situation without sagittal, without sagittal space. And the opposite situation by angle, progenic or mesial occlusion, or third class of occlusion, of pathological occlusion by angle. It is opposite situation when mesial buccal cusp of upper first molar is located behind transverse groove of lower first molar. Let's talk about advantages and disadvantages of this classification, angle classification. It is nowadays it is the most widespread classification around the world. And I hope you know why. Because it is simple classification, but main disadvantage of this classification, angle classification, describe all pathology only in sagittal plane, but not describe pathology in transverse or horizontal plane, or vertical plane. Because we know pathology like open occlusion, it is pathology in the transverse plane. What does it mean, open occlusion? Open occlusion, it is pathology without contacts between antagonists. Open occlusion can be frontal or distal, but distal open occlusion can be one side or both sides. And opposite situation from open occlusion, deep occlusion. Deep occlusion, it is situation when upper frontal teeth cover lower frontal teeth more than one third length of crown of lower frontal teeth. And cross bite or cross occlusion, anterior and posterior. What does it mean, cross bite? Cross bite, it means opposite situation to normal correlation between upper and lower frontal teeth, or upper and lower buccal teeth. And first class of pathological occlusion according angle is called neutral occlusion. Please, colleagues, remember that First class of occlusion, it is not normal occlusion. According Edward Engel, first class of occlusion, it is occlusion with normal physiological correlation between first molars. It means that big Q of occlusion is saved, and all pathology is located frontally from first molars, like here. As can you see, molars and premolars have correct relation, but frontal teeth, like tooth number 2-2, has palatal position, tooth number 2-3 has vestibular position. So doctors, thank you very much.